The scorching Alabama sun beat down on the dusty streets of Montgomery as Staff Sergeant Williams adjusted his uniform one last time before boarding the Greyhound bus. His fingers traced over the Purple Heart pinned to his chest, a reminder of the shrapnel that had nearly taken his life in Korea 18 months ago. The metal felt cool against his fingertips, a stark contrast to the humid summer air that clung to his skin. He stood tall, despite the weight of his military duffel bag and the exhaustion that seeped deep into his bones. 3 days of travel, changing buses at every major city, surviving on coffee and sandwich shop meals, it had been a long journey home. But his mother's sweet potato pie and his little sister's endless stories awaited him just a few hours away. The bus depot buzzed with afternoon activity. Ladies in floral dresses fanned themselves with folded newspapers, children chased each other around suitcases, and businessmen in wrinkled suits checked their watches impatiently. A young boy tugged at his mother's skirt, pointing at Williams' medals with wide-eyed wonder. Williams gave him a gentle smile and a small wave, remembering how he used to look at soldiers the same way when he was that age. The driver called for boarding, and people began forming a line. Williams took his place, ticket clutched in his hand, watching as passengers filed past him. Some nodded respectfully at his uniform, while others averted their eyes. He'd seen both reactions before. It was part of wearing the uniform in 1956. Inside the bus, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the Alabama heat. The seats were worn but clean, their green upholstery faded from years of passengers and sunlight. Williams moved carefully down the aisle, his duffel bag bumping softly against the seats. The familiar smell of diesel fuel mixed with leather and summer sweat brought back memories of his first bus ride to basic training, what felt like a lifetime ago. He spotted an empty seat about halfway down the bus next to a window. Perfect. He could rest his head against the glass and maybe catch some sleep. His mother didn't know he was coming home today. He wanted to surprise her. He could already picture her face, the way her eyes would light up when she opened the door and found him standing there. The bus was filling up quickly now. A grandmother helped her grandchildren settle into their seats, handing out paper bags of penny candy to keep them quiet during the journey. 2 college students discussed their summer plans in excited whispers. A tired-looking waitress in her uniform slipped off her shoes as soon as she sat down, rubbing her feet with a sigh of relief. Williams felt himself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of travel. His mind wandered to the friends he'd left behind in Korea, wondering how they were doing, if they'd made it home yet. He thought about writing to them once he got settled, telling them about how nothing and everything had changed back home. The last passengers were boarding now. He watched through the window as goodbyes were exchanged on the platform, hugs, waves, and promises to write. A young couple shared a quick kiss before the woman hurried onto the bus, her cheeks pink with embarrassment when she realized people were watching. The driver started the engine, its rumble vibrating through the floor. Williams closed his eyes, letting his head rest against the window. Just a few more hours and he'd be home. He could almost taste his mother's cooking, hear his sister's laugh, feel the comfort of his own bed. After 18 months of military cots and army meals, after the thunder of artillery and the cries of wounded men, after everything he'd seen and done, he was finally heading home. Little did he know that this routine bus ride was about to become something much more significant. As the driver made his final checks and prepared to depart, no one on board could have guessed that they were about to witness a moment that would ripple through their community and change lives forever. But for now, in this quiet moment, Staff Sergeant Williams was just a soldier heading home, carrying with him the hope of a peaceful return to normal life. The Greyhound bus rumbled down the highway, its wheels eating up miles of sun-baked asphalt. Staff Sergeant Williams had finally started to doze off, lulled by the gentle swaying of the bus and the quiet murmur of conversations around him. His combat boots were planted firmly on the floor, and his uniform, despite the long journey, remained remarkably crisp, a habit drilled into him through years of military service. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the seats. A child's laugh rang out from somewhere in the back, followed by a mother's gentle shushing. The bus was about half full, with plenty of empty seats scattered throughout. Williams had chosen a spot in the middle section, hoping to catch some rest before reaching home. His thoughts drifted to the welcome he'd receive. His mother would probably cry. She always did, even when he just came home on leave. His sister would have grown taller. She was at that age where kids seem to shoot up overnight. He wondered if old Mr. Thompson still ran the corner store, if Mrs. Washington still sang in the church choir every Sunday. The peaceful moment shattered like glass when the driver's voice cut through the air, sharp as a knife. "Hey you, soldier!" The bus lurched to a sudden stop, sending a ripple of surprised murmurs through the passengers. "You know better than that." Back of the bus. Williams opened his eyes slowly, the weight of reality settling back onto his shoulders. He'd seen too much, fought too hard, lost too many friends to feel anything but a deep, bone-tired sadness at the familiar words. Around him, the atmosphere shifted. Some passengers suddenly became very interested in their newspapers or the passing scenery. Others watched with barely concealed interest, waiting to see what would happen next. A young mother pulled her curious child closer, whispering something in his ear. An elderly man in a worn suit gripped his hat tighter, his knuckles white with tension. Two teenage girls stopped their giggling conversation, their eyes wide as they watched the scene unfold. The driver's face appeared in the large rearview mirror, his expression hard and unyielding. I won't say it again. Rules are rules. Williams looked down at his uniform, at the medals that spoke of sacrifice and courage. His fingers brushed against the Purple Heart again, but this time it didn't feel cool. It felt heavy, like it was made of lead instead of metal. He thought about the men he'd served with in Korea, how they'd bled the same color, how they'd saved each other's lives without once thinking about skin color. The silence in the bus grew thicker, broken only by the idle rumble of the engine and the soft whoosh of cars passing by on the highway. A bead of sweat rolled down Williams' back, but he didn't move. Not yet. In his mind, he could hear his father's voice from years ago. "Sometimes, son, dignity is all a man has. Hold on to it tight." The air conditioning hummed overhead, doing little to cut through the tension that had settled over the passengers like a heavy blanket. Williams began to gather his things, each movement deliberate and measured. His duffel bag felt heavier now, weighted down not just with his belongings, but with the familiar burden of discrimination. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A businessman loosened his tie, perhaps feeling the same suffocating pressure that seemed to fill the bus. An older woman clutched her purse tighter, her lips pressed into a thin line as she stared straight ahead. Just as Williams stood up, just as he prepared to make that long walk to the back of the bus, a voice broke through the silence. A voice that would change everything. But in this moment, suspended between standing and sitting, between dignity and humiliation, between the world as it was and the world as it should be, Staff Sergeant Williams stood tall in his uniform, a reminder of the strange contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. The tension on the bus was thick enough to cut with a knife when a strong, clear voice rang out from the back. "Just a moment, driver." The words weren't shouted, but they carried such authority that everyone on the bus turned to look. The voice belonged to an older white gentleman in a well-worn gray suit. He was sitting about 3 rows behind Williams, and now he was slowly rising to his feet. His silver hair caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, and though he leaned on a wooden walking stick, his bearing was unmistakably military. Years of command showed in the way he held himself, in the quiet confidence of his movements. The passengers watched in stunned silence as he made his way forward, the tap of his walking stick marking each step. His face bore the weathered look of someone who'd seen his share of battles, and a small pin on his lapel identified him as a retired Marine Corps officer. "Sir," the driver started to say, but the older man raised his hand slightly, and somehow that small gesture was enough to silence any protest. "I've been sitting here," the man said, his voice carrying clearly through the bus, watching a decorated American soldier being told to move because of the color of his skin. He paused, letting his words sink in. "I served in 2 wars, and I can tell you this, bullets and shrapnel don't care what color you are. Neither does courage." A baby started crying somewhere in the middle of the bus, and its mother quickly hushed it. The air conditioning hummed overhead, but nobody seemed to notice the cool air anymore. Every eye was fixed on the scene playing out in the aisle. The older man turned slightly, addressing the other passengers now. "Look at his uniform," he continued, gesturing toward Williams. "Look at those medals." That Purple Heart, do you know what that means? It means he shed blood for this country, for all of us. His voice wasn't angry, but it carried a weight of conviction that made several passengers lower their eyes. A young woman in a blue dress dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Two men in work clothes exchanged glances, then looked down at their hands. The businessman who had been so interested in his newspaper earlier let it drop to his lap, forgotten. I commanded men of every color in combat, the older man went on, his voice softening slightly. And I can tell you this, when you're in a foxhole with artillery falling all around you, you don't care about the color of the man next to you. You care about his courage, his loyalty, his willingness to lay down his life for his fellow soldiers. He turned back to the driver, who was watching the scene unfold in his rearview mirror. Now, I understand you have rules to follow, but sometimes rules need to be challenged. Sometimes they need to change, and sometimes we need to be the ones to take that first step. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows, creating long shadows in the aisle. A car horn humped somewhere outside, a reminder that the world was going on as usual beyond the walls of this bus. But inside, time seemed to stand still as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Williams hadn't moved from his spot. He stood straight and tall, his military bearing evident in every line of his body. But there was something in his eyes now, not hope exactly, but perhaps the ghost of it. He'd seen too much to hope too quickly, but something was happening here, something unexpected and powerful. The older man's walking stick tapped against the floor as he shifted his weight. I didn't fight in 2 wars to come home and watch fellow soldiers being treated this way, he said quietly, but his words carried to every corner of the bus. None of us fought for that. A woman whispered something to her young son, who was watching the scene with wide eyes. An elderly lady in the back nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap. The college students who had been discussing their summer plans earlier sat in complete silence, textbooks forgotten on their laps. The bus remained motionless on the highway, its engine idling. The moment stretched out, filled with possibility. In that suspended moment, something was changing, not just for the people on this bus, but perhaps for the community they lived in. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, with one person willing to stand up and speak truth to power. The retired Marine Corps officer took another step forward, his walking stick making a soft tap against the floor of the bus. The afternoon light streaming through the windows caught the silver in his hair and the determination in his eyes. His next words came slowly, deliberately, each one carrying the weight of decades of experience. I remember the first time I saw combat, he began, his voice steady but gentle. It was a cold morning in Europe during the Second World War. We were pinned down by enemy fire, and a young soldier from Georgia saved my life. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. He pulled me to safety while bullets flew all around us. I never got to thank him properly. He didn't make it home. The bus was absolutely silent now. Even the children who had been fidgeting in their seats were still, sensing the importance of the moment. Outside, cars continued to pass by, their drivers unaware of the small piece of history unfolding inside this Greyhound bus. That soldier who saved my life, he looked different from me. But in that moment, all I saw was his courage, his humanity. The older man's eyes swept across the bus, meeting the gazes of various passengers. Just like today, all I see when I look at this soldier is his service, his sacrifice, his willingness to defend our nation. A woman in the front row wiped a tear from her cheek. The businessman who had been pretending to read his newspaper earlier now sat with his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the retired officer. 2 teenage boys who had been joking around earlier sat perfectly still, that usual restlessness replaced by rapt attention. I've commanded men from every state in this nation, from every background you can imagine, the officer continued. And I can tell you this, courage knows no color. Leadership knows no color. Sacrifice knows no color. His voice grew stronger with each word, filled with the authority of someone who had seen the truth of what he was saying. He gestured to William's Purple Heart. You see that medal? I have one just like it. Got it in the Pacific Theater. The blood we shed was the same color. The pain we felt was the same pain. The sacrifices we made were for the same country. This country, our country. A ray of sunlight fell across William's medals, making them gleam. The retired officer pointed to them with his free hand. Each one of those medals tells a story of bravery, of duty, of service to our nation. And those stories deserve our respect, no matter who wears the uniform. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, but the atmosphere in the bus had changed. What had started as a tense confrontation was transforming into something else, a moment of shared understanding, of hearts and minds beginning to shift. "I've lived long enough to see a lot of changes in this world," the older man said, his voice softening. "Some good, some bad. But the one thing I've learned is that change doesn't just happen on its own. It happens when good people find the courage to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" He turned to face the driver directly now. "So I'm standing up. Right here, right now. Because if we can fight side by side in foreign lands, we surely can sit side by side on this bus in our own country." An elderly woman in a floral dress nodded slowly, clutching her purse a little tighter. A young mother held her child closer, whispering something in his ear, perhaps explaining the significance of what they were witnessing. The college students who had been chattering earlier now sat in thoughtful silence, their textbooks forgotten in their laps. The walking stick tapped once more against the floor as the retired officer shifted his weight. "Sometimes," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the bus, "the hardest battles we fight aren't on foreign soil. Sometimes they're right here at home, in our own hearts and minds. And sometimes victory doesn't come with medals and parades. Sometimes it comes quietly, in moments just like this one." The sun had shifted slightly, casting long shadows through the bus windows. Time seemed suspended, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In this moment, on this ordinary bus on an ordinary afternoon, something extraordinary was taking place, a small but significant battle in the longer war for human dignity and respect. The retired officer's words hung in the air like morning mist, and slowly something remarkable began to happen. The atmosphere on the bus started to shift, as if a heavy curtain was being lifted from people's eyes. It started with small gestures, a slight nod here, a thoughtful look there, the quiet rustling of people shifting in their seats as their consciences stirred. A young woman in a blue cotton dress, who had been clutching her handbag tightly since the confrontation began, slowly loosened her grip. Her fingers, marked with the calluses of someone who worked hard for a living, smoothed over the worn leather of her bag. She looked down at her hands, then up at Williams, seeing perhaps for the first time not a color, but a soldier who had fought for her freedom. Near the front of the bus, two teenage boys who had been whispering and snickering earlier sat in unusual stillness. The older one kept glancing at his own reflection in the window, then back at William's uniform. His younger brother pulled out a small notebook and began to write, as if he knew he was witnessing something worth remembering. An elderly woman in the back, her gray hair neatly pinned under a Sunday hat, sat straighter in her seat. She had lived through 2 wars herself, sent a husband and 2 sons to fight. Her weathered face showed the quiet recognition of sacrifice, of service that went beyond any single race or creed. The bus driver's hands still gripped the steering wheel, but his knuckles weren't as white as before. Through the large rearview mirror, his eyes kept darting between Williams, the retired officer, and the road ahead, as if he were looking at a map and trying to find his way. A mother with 2 small children, who had been trying to keep them quiet with picture books, now turned their attention to what was happening. "Look at his medals," she whispered to them, her voice carrying in the quiet bus. "Each one tells a story of bravery." The children stared with wide-eyed wonder at the ribbons and pins on William's chest. The businessman who had buried himself in his newspaper when the trouble started now folded it carefully and set it aside. His hands settled in his lap, and there was something different in his expression, not quite shame, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Through the windows, the Alabama landscape rolled by, cotton fields, pine trees, small farmhouses in the distance. The sun was lower now, painting everything in soft golden light. It was the same world outside the bus as it had been 10 minutes ago, but inside, everything was changing. A young factory worker in his dusty overalls straightened the cap on his head. He looked down at his own hands, calloused from hard work, then at William's uniform with its combat ribbons. Something passed across his face, recognition, perhaps, of another kind of hard work, another kind of sacrifice. Near the middle of the bus, a college student with textbooks piled on her lap closed the one she'd been pretending to read. She caught William's eye for a moment and gave him a small, tentative smile, the kind of smile that suggested she'd just learned something no textbook could teach. The air conditioning continued its steady hum, but the air itself felt different now. The tension that had filled the bus like a heavy fog was beginning to clear. In its place was something new, not comfort exactly, but the kind of discomfort that comes with growth, with minds and hearts stretching to accommodate new truths. Some passengers still avoided looking directly at the scene unfolding before them, but their averted eyes now seemed more about processing their own thoughts than avoiding the situation. The quiet on the bus wasn't the silence of fear or anger anymore, it was the silence of people thinking, questioning, reconsidering. An older man in work clothes, his hands rough from years of manual labor, reached up to touch the brim of his hat, a small gesture of respect that spoke volumes. Beside him, his wife dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, moved perhaps by memories of her own loved ones who had served. Even the rhythm of the bus engine seemed different now, its steady rumble no longer just background noise, but the soundtrack to this moment of change. Through the windows, shadows were growing longer, but inside the bus, something was becoming clearer with each passing second. This wasn't just about one soldier and his right to sit where he chose. It wasn't even just about rules and regulations. This was about something bigger, about who they were as people, as a community, as Americans. In the faces of the passengers, you could see the struggle between old habits and new understandings, between the comfortable familiarity of the way things had always been and the challenging possibility of how they could be. The bus driver's hands remained frozen on the steering wheel, his reflection in the large rearview mirror showing a face caught between duty and conscience. Beads of sweat had formed on his forehead, and his uniform collar suddenly felt too tight. He'd been driving this route for 15 years, following the same rules day after day, but something was different now. Through the mirror, he watched the scene behind him. The retired officer still stood in the aisle, leaning slightly on his walking stick, dignity and determination radiating from his stance. The soldier Williams remained where he was, his combat medals catching the late afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows. The other passengers sat in expectant silence, waiting to see what would happen next. The driver's mind wandered to his own father, who had served in the First World War. He remembered the stories his father used to tell about the men he'd fought alongside, stories of courage, brotherhood, and sacrifice. Stories that never mentioned the color of anyone's skin. A car honked as it passed the stopped bus, bringing the driver back to the present moment. He loosened his grip on the steering wheel slightly, noticing how his knuckles had turned white. The rules were clear, they always had been. But rules, he was beginning to realize, weren't always right. He thought about his own son, now in high school, who might one day wear a uniform like the one Williams wore. The medals, the Purple Heart, they spoke of sacrifice, of pain endured in service to country. How could he explain to his son why he'd forced a decorated soldier to move to the back of the bus? The air conditioning hummed overhead, but the driver felt warm under his collar. He adjusted his cap, a nervous habit he developed over years of handling difficult situations. But this situation was different. This wasn't about maintaining order or following protocol. This was about something much more fundamental. Through the mirror, he could see an elderly woman in a floral dress whispering a prayer, her lips moving silently. Two young men in work clothes exchanged glances, then nodded slightly, as if coming to their own private understanding. A mother held her child closer, perhaps wondering what lesson this moment would teach. The driver's eyes met Williams in the mirror. In that brief moment of eye contact, he saw not defiance or anger, but quiet dignity. The same dignity he'd seen in old photographs of his father in uniform. The same dignity the retired officer embodied as he stood in the aisle, waiting for justice to prevail. Outside, the world continued as usual. Cars passed by, birds flew overhead, the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon. But inside the bus, time seemed suspended, waiting for one man's decision to tip the scales toward justice or injustice. The driver's thoughts turned to his own daily routine. The hundreds of passengers he carried, the countless stops he made, the rules he followed without question. He thought about how change happens, how progress moves forward, and how sometimes it starts with one person making one decision. His hand moved to the gear shift, then paused. Years of habit fought against the stirring of conscience in his heart. The retired officer's words echoed in his mind. If we can fight side by side in foreign lands, we surely can sit side by side on this bus in our own country. A young woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The businessman who had been hiding behind his newspaper now sat watching openly, his face showing a mix of emotions. Everyone on the bus seemed to be holding their breath, aware that they were witnessing something important. The driver adjusted his mirror one more time, taking in the whole scene. Williams standing tall in his uniform, the retired officer standing firm in his conviction, the passengers waiting to see which way the scales of justice would tip. In that moment, he realized that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking with tradition, meant being the first to step away from the familiar path. Finally, he cleared his throat. The sound seemed unusually loud in the quiet bus. His voice, when it came, was softer than usual, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Take any seat you want, Sergeant. We've got a schedule to keep." With those simple words, he felt something shift, not just on the bus, but in himself. He straightened his cap one last time, checked his mirrors, and eased the bus back into motion. As the engine rumbled to life, he realized that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest decisions. Years passed, but the memory of that day on the bus remained as clear as morning dew on grass. The story spread through the community like ripples in a pond, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. It became more than just a tale about a bus ride. It became a symbol of how small acts of courage could change hearts and minds. The retired officer and staff, Sergeant Williams, didn't just go their separate ways after that day. They'd formed an unlikely friendship that surprised many but inspired even more. Every Sunday after church, you could find them sharing coffee at the local diner, their conversation flowing as easily as the coffee being poured into their cups. Children who had been on the bus that day grew up telling their own children about what they'd witnessed. The young boy who had watched wide-eyed while clutching his mother's hand became a teacher, and he made sure his students understood that change doesn't always come with loud protests and big marches. Sometimes it comes in quiet moments of dignity and determination. The bus driver's decision that day affected him more deeply than anyone might have guessed. He kept driving his route, but passengers noticed a different kind of warmth in his greetings, a gentler approach to his duties. Years later, his grandson would proudly tell the story at a school history presentation, speaking about how his grandfather had chosen to be on the right side of change. The two teenage boys who had watched everything unfold took different paths in life. One became a civil rights lawyer, the other a local minister. But both carried the lesson they'd learned that day: that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Local newspapers eventually picked up the story. At first, it was just a small article in the community section, but it grew into something bigger. People started sharing their own memories of that day, how it had made them question things they'd always taken for granted. The young woman in the blue dress wrote a letter to the editor, describing how that moment had changed her perspective forever. The elderly lady who had whispered prayers that day told the story to her quilting circle, and they incorporated it into a beautiful quilt that still hangs in the local library. Each patch represents a different aspect of the story: a purple heart, a bus, two men standing tall, a community changing. When the retired officer passed away years later, the church couldn't hold all the people who came to pay their respects. Williams spoke at the funeral, his voice steady despite his emotion. He talked about friendship, about courage, about how one person's willingness to stand up can give others the strength to stand too. The story became part of the town's unofficial history, passed down from generation to generation. Parents would point out the bus stop to their children, telling them about the day when courage and dignity won over prejudice and fear. The local historical society created a small exhibit, displaying photographs and written accounts that captured the significance of that moment. Students at the high school started an annual essay contest inspired by the event, writing about moments in their own lives when they'd seen small acts of courage make big changes. The winning essays were displayed alongside the quilted wall hanging in the library, adding new layers to the story each year. The diner where Williams and the retired officer used to meet became a kind of landmark. People would point out their regular table to visitors, speaking in hushed, respectful tones about the friendship that had grown from that day on the bus. The owner's daughter eventually took over the business, and she made sure the story stayed alive, sometimes sharing it with travelers who stopped in for a meal. As the years rolled by, the world changed in big ways and small. New buses rolled down the streets, new buildings rose up, new faces filled the sidewalks. But the impact of that day never faded. It lived on in the way people treated each other, in the stories they told their children, in the pride they took in being part of a community that had chosen to change. Williams lived to see many of these changes. In his later years, he would sometimes sit on his front porch, watching the world go by, thinking about how a single moment of courage had created such lasting ripples. Young people would sometimes stop by to hear him tell the story firsthand, and he never tired of sharing it, always emphasizing that the power to change things for the better lies within each person's heart. The story became more than just a memory. It became a reminder that progress often starts with individual choices, with small moments of bravery, with people willing to stand up for what's right. It showed that sometimes the most powerful changes don't come from grand gestures or loud proclamations, but from quiet moments of dignity and determination, from people choosing to do the right thing even when it isn't easy.